Hello and thank you for joining us here on CBS News Chicago. I'm Joe Donlon.
And I'm Irika, Sargent. Guilty verdicts in the federal case against R&B singer R. Kelly. Jurors convicting him on 6 of the 13 charges against him. It took the jury nearly 11 hours of deliberations. Now, attorney David Fish represented the first witness called in his New York trial, that federal trial that he had a previous conviction on. David joins us now on the stream. Thank you, David. Before we get to your role in the other cases, I just want to get your thoughts as someone who's largely represented sexual harassment and abuse victims for quite some time. As you followed this case, what are your thoughts on the verdicts today?
Well, I'm glad that R. Kelly will most likely be spending the rest of his life, or nearly the rest of his life, in prison. It's a very sad day, though, for Chicago, in that we know that we allowed this to go on for over 20 years. So many victims and so many young girls that were impacted by him. And, I'm grateful that he was convicted. I think it's disappointing that his enablers were not convicted, but I think that was a tough case against them.
How do you think that happened, David? Because there have been a number of people who've pointed out today that this should have never happened for 20 years. I mean, there was a trial in 2008, and he was acquitted.
So one of the things that R. Kelly and also people like Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, Epstein, one of the things that they all have in common is they use non-disclosure agreements. So they have victim after victim after victim, and then they pay them some money and make them sign agreements that they're not going to tell anybody. What that allows is it allows for more women to be victimized because people don't know about what's going on. And that's one of the problems that we see right now in the law, is that these kind of confidentiality agreements are enforceable.
So, David, when we talk about your client, Jerhonda Pace, I want to get a little background on how you came to represent her. And she's had quite a long history in terms of previous cases with R. Kelly. And when you talk about this idea of, it being public, how did that factor into you representing her?
So Ms. Pace came to us many years ago. She had a relationship with R. Kelly when she was 16, and it quickly turned into him abusing her. And he was physically abusive to her, sexually abusive to her, emotionally abusive to her. And, as she grew up, she realized that this was wrong. And, the same thing that happened to her happened to a lot of other girls that were approximately her same age. So she came to us because she needed a voice to speak up for herself. And so that's what we helped her with.
How would you compare the case you were involved with in New York and this case here, the most recent federal case in Chicago?
Well, they were very different. I mean, the case in New York essentially was saying that R. Kelly ran a criminal enterprise. This case here related more to the trial that happened, almost 15 years ago, relating to the prior child pornography claims that were brought against R. Kelly. But they had some very similarities in that there was just victim after victim that R. Kelly had abused. And it was good to hear their stories to be able to come forward. And I think that helps with the recovery process that these survivors go through.
David, there are still cases pending here in Cook County. There's a case out of Minnesota. What do you see happening next in terms of outcomes for R. Kelly? We're seeing the New York one, guilty, 6 of the 13 counts here for the federal one in Chicago.
I don't think R. Kelly will see the light of day outside of a prison, likely ever, which I think is a good thing. I think that his survivors can feel safer knowing that that's the case. The reason that there are all of these additional cases, if the guy is going to spend his life in prison, you may ask, why continue to pile on him? But it really gives the survivors, the victims, the community a chance to have justice, and it allows people to come forward and start the healing process. Often speaking up and testifying in court can be part of a person's healing process to get them over the abuse that occurred to them.
So the guilty verdicts are obviously getting a lot of the attention, David, but I think the not guilty verdicts are almost as interesting. You mentioned the NDAs and the agreements that some of these folks have made in the past. What do you make of the counts he was found not guilty of, conspiring to cover up incriminating tapes ahead of the 2008 trial? And some of the other things, like we were wondering too, I know you can probably address this about why the other two not guilties were coercing a minor for Tracy and Brittany when the other three were guilties.
You know, what I think happened here is the jury carefully looked at all the evidence, and they wanted to carefully go through the counts and do their job, which is what they're supposed to do. And that's precisely what they did. So the nice thing, I suppose you could say, is it only takes one count to convict him. And so he's been convicted here in addition to New York. And I think also significantly, you know, the not guilty verdicts against his co-defendants, while they were found not guilty, I really commend the Department of Justice for bringing those claims. Those were tough cases. I mean, they were being charged with things that happened 20 years ago. So that was a really tough task for the prosecution to prove. And while the jury found them not guilty here, I think it sends a message to other enablers that, you know, the law enforcement's going to come after them if they go, you know, if they enable other people to commit sexual misconduct, whether it's acting like an ostrich and putting your head in the sand and pretending that you don't know about it, or if it's helping financially, or it's coordinating. You know, R. Kelly and other predators, they don't go out to high schools picking up young girls. They rely on other people to help out with that. And so what the Department of Justice is doing is sending a message to other enablers that they may be charged. You saw it in the Epstein case, his enabler, Miss Maxwell. She was charged and she was convicted in that case. So, you know, this is a loud and clear message that people can't support predators.
David, R. Kelly's lead defense attorney, Ms. Bonjean, she was asking the jury, especially in her closing arguments, to set aside what they know about R. Kelly, and even at some points talking about how he did some beautiful things when it comes to his music. He should have all of his humanity stripped away. When you think about their strategy, as someone who's been in the legal profession for such a long time, what do you think about the tactics used by the defense to try and win this case, and the fact that Ms. Bonjean even said at one point that she saw it as some sort of victory that he was convicted on less than half of these counts?
Yeah, I really think that's a hollow victory. He was convicted, and that's the bottom line, and he'll probably never get out of prison. I mean, she was doing her job, and I respect her for that, but I was bothered that, for instance, in the closing argument, some of the witnesses for the prosecution were referred to as cockroaches. I thought that was shameful when she referred to, you know, if you have a cockroach in your bowl of soup, you don't just throw out the cockroach, you throw out the whole bowl of soup. These survivors are not cockroaches. They are women who have been traumatized by a predator and who were put through a horrific experience, often over and over and over. And they've been dealing with their own trauma and recovery. And so to refer to them as you know, cockroaches, I don't know if it backfired to the jury or not, but I thought that it was unfortunate.
This has been going on, David, for 20 years, as you well know. I think it's interesting when you step back and look at what's happened over those at least 15 to 20 years, where you had sex tapes, you had a trial in 2008, yet it's the documentary, Surviving R. Kelly, that really turned this whole thing around.
Yeah, I'm so proud of, you know, our client, Jerhonda. She was one of the stars of the Surviving R. Kelly show, and she wrote a book. And, you know, the Me Too movement, I really think, has motivated so many women to come forward. We're seeing it so much more in our practice, where we're seeing victims of sexual harassment in the workplace and outside of the workplace finally standing up and feeling comfortable to say something. Now, unfortunately, I don't think that was the case for the last 20 years. And if you look at what happened, it's somewhat shameful that R. Kelly was allowed to continue on for so many years. When he started this, it was well known in the legal community that R. Kelly has relationships with underage women. It was well known in the news. I mean, there were publications. The Sun-Times had an article about this nearly 20 years ago. And to allow this to have occurred year after year, it wasn't till, and I commend Kim Foxx for finally, I think it was in 2019, she held a press conference and she asked for other victims of R. Kelly to come forward. Why didn't she do that? Or why didn't her predecessor do that, I should say, 10 years ago after they knew that he was involved in child pornography? Why did it take so long? And it's just shameful that so much time was allowed to pass. I do really commend the United States Attorney's Office for finally putting their foot down and charging him in New York and charging him in Chicago and moving forward.
David, I just had one last question, and we are wrapping up here. But when we talk about your client, Jerhonda, who you've been working with for quite some time, what does she think about all this? Have you been in contact with her regarding what happened today? Is this something that she's still following, or is she trying to just put all of this behind her at this point?
Well, I haven't talked to her today, but yeah, she's moved on with her life, and I'm very proud of her. I mean, she now has, I think, 5 children, and she's moved on and she's a professional. And by speaking up, she was able to do that. She was able to get her justice, in the courtroom. She was able to be heard, and she's grown up to be just a wonderful woman.
David Fish with Fish, Bonner, Bolanos. Thank you very much for your time and your insight. We appreciate your perspective. Thanks for the time.
Yes, and we will have much more coming up on the 10 o'clock news. We will be right back.